My colleagues have referenced quotes from Attorney General Barr, National Security Advisor Bolton. The FBI is enormous, 38,000 agents, $9 billion budget. I am troubled by your lack of senior law enforcement leadership. We disagree on some important policy views, but the thing that bothers me the most is a whole series of statements you've made in a variety of settings that suggest you would struggle to be independent from White House direction or control, as has long been the modern history of the FBI. Who does the director of the FBI work for, Mr. Patel?
Senator, thank you for that question. The immediate report for the director of the FBI is into the Office of the Deputy Attorney General. Then that report is taken into the Office of the Attorney General and ultimately the White House and the chamber.
At a Senate hearing in Washington, D.C. during National Police Week, Senator Chris Coons asked FBI Director Kash Patel a question so simple it should have landed like a receipt on a kitchen table. How much did your trip to Milan cost? Not why did you go, not how patriotic was the mission, not how many acronyms could be packed into one answer, but how much taxpayer money went out the door. And the stunning part was not that Patel defended the trip. The stunning part was that he never gave the number. This is the same Kash Patel who once blasted Chris Wray over government jet travel, saying a government-funded G5 was outrageous, and throwing around the figure of $15,000 every time the plane took off. So when Senator Chris Coons put the question back on him, the room did not just hear a travel question, it heard a test of whether the standard Kash Patel used on other people would survive contact with Kash Patel himself. This was not a normal oversight hearing. This was a hearing where the director of the FBI, the agency trusted with counterintelligence, domestic security, cyber threats, and major federal investigations, was being asked to explain whether public power was being used with private convenience quietly attached to it. Patel answered by talking about the Olympics, the World Cup, Formula One, the Super Bowl, 250,000 Americans traveling to Milan, and a Chinese cybercriminal returned to the United States. All of that may sound impressive, and some of it may even be relevant, but none of it answers the basic question sitting in the chair across from him. What did the trip cost? That is where the moral problem begins, because when a public official replaces a dollar figure with a national security speech, he is not clarifying the record. He is fogging the glass. The real issue is not whether the FBI has security duties overseas. Of course it does. The real issue is whether Kash Patel can attack one FBI director for travel costs, then refuse to name his own costs when the same spotlight turns around. A taxpayer does not need a classified briefing to understand that double standards are how trust dies. And Senator Chris Coons, by asking one plain question, exposed the crack in the whole performance. When accountability came due, Kash Patel brought a story instead of a number. Now switch into prosecutorial mode, because this is where the testimony stops being a polite exchange and starts looking like a cross-examination with the receipt missing from the folder. Senator Chris Coons did not ask Kash Patel to reveal a covert source, expose an operational method, or compromise an active investigation. He asked how much the Milan trip cost and whether that trip helped Patel carry out his mission as FBI director. That is a budget question, an oversight question, a taxpayer question, and in a functioning system, it should not require verbal gymnastics. But instead of opening with the cost, Patel opened with the mission, and that choice matters because people usually hide the weak part of an answer behind the strongest sounding part of a story. Patel said the FBI and DHS are responsible for security around major events like the Olympics, the World Cup, Formula One, and the Super Bowl. He said 250,000 Americans traveled to Milan, that the FBI stood up a joint operations center, and that there were 0 major security incidents involving American citizens. That sounds like a victory lap, and on its own terms, yes, protecting Americans overseas is a serious responsibility. But the question was never whether public safety matters. The question was whether Patel needed that trip at that cost in that manner, while refusing to say what the cost actually was. A public official cannot use a successful security outcome like a giant umbrella to cover every unanswered financial detail underneath it. Then came the second layer of the answer, the part that made the room even more uncomfortable. Patel pointed to a Chinese cybercriminal in Italian custody and said that while there, the FBI helped arrange for that individual to be expelled from Italy and returned to the United States. That is not a small claim. It turns a travel cost question into a national security trophy case. But again, the logic has a hole big enough to drive a government jet through, because proving that an operation happened is not the same as proving that Kash Patel's personal trip was required for it to happen. The Department of Justice can confirm the extradition, Italian cooperation, cyber charges, and the seriousness of the case, but that still does not magically produce the missing dollar figure Senator Chris Coons asked for. This is where the contradiction gets sharp. Before becoming FBI director, Kash Patel criticized Chris Wray for government aircraft use, mocking the idea of a government-funded G5 and pointing to $15,000 every time it took off. That was Patel's own moral standard, not something invented by his critics after the fact. He framed expensive government travel as a symbol of entitlement, waste, and elite comfort wrapped in official language. So when Patel later faces a question about his own Milan trip, the fair test is brutally simple. Does the rule still apply when the name on the itinerary is Kash Patel? And this is why the answer felt less like transparency and more like damage control in a suit. Because if the trip cost little, say it. If the trip cost a lot but was necessary, explain it clearly, give the figure, and let Congress judge the mission against the money. But when the number disappears and the answer becomes a parade of Olympics, cybercriminals, China, Italy, Americans abroad, and zero incidents, the silence starts doing the talking. The missing figure becomes the most important witness in the room. That is the moral pressure point Senator Chris Coons exposed. This was not a debate over whether the FBI should protect Americans, because nobody serious is arguing against that. It was a debate over whether a director who once used travel costs as a weapon against someone else is willing to live under the same weapon when it swings back toward him. And the answer on that day was not convincing, because accountability is not measured by how many impressive facts you can stack beside the question. Accountability is measured by whether you answer the question that was actually asked. For ordinary Americans, this is not abstract. They do not get to tell the IRS, their bank, their boss, or their landlord a heroic story when asked for a number. They have to show the bill, explain the charge, and own the consequence. So when the FBI director sits in front of Congress and turns a cost question into a national security narration, the public sees the old Washington trick in its cleanest form. When power owes an answer, power gives a speech. The third problem is darker, because the Milan trip was only the visible spark, not the whole fire. Right after Senator Chris Coons pressed Kash Patel on the cost of travel, the hearing moved into something far more serious. Whether the FBI had weakened its own counterintelligence capacity at the exact moment the country needed it most. Coons raised reports that around 10 FBI agents or analysts with Iran expertise, including people fluent in Farsi and experienced in counterterrorism, had been terminated just before the United States entered a war posture involving Iran. That is not a personnel footnote. That is the kind of detail that should make every senator sit up straight, put the talking points down, and ask who exactly was removed, why they were removed, and what capacity was lost. Patel's answer was blunt. He said the public reporting was not accurate, then pointed to a new Iran Threats Mission Center and claimed a 47% increase in arrests of Iranian spies. That answer sounds strong until you examine the structure of it. Saying we created a new center does not answer whether experienced people were fired. Saying arrests increased 47% does not prove the source networks are intact, the language expertise remains, or the Bureau still has the same human access inside sensitive communities. Arrests are the visible ending of some investigations, not the invisible beginning of prevention. A country can increase arrests and still lose the deeper intelligence capacity that tells agents where to look before the threat becomes a case number. This is the internal contradiction that deserved a follow-up. Patel denied the reporting, but he also described a new structure as if the new structure itself solved the concern. That is like a hospital administrator saying, "No, we did not lose our best surgeons, and anyway, we painted a new emergency room sign." The sign may be real, the room may be open, but the question is whether the people with the rare skills are still inside. Counterintelligence is not plug-and-play work, and nobody serious should pretend that years of trust, language ability, source handling, and threat mapping can be replaced by a fresh office name and a clean statistic. Then comes the Section 702 issue, and this is where the oversight problem becomes institutional. Section 702 is a surveillance authority tied to foreign intelligence collection, but in practice, it can sweep up communications involving Americans, which means oversight is not optional decoration, it is the lock on the door. Patel told Senator Coons that the FBI and intelligence leadership had provided at least a dozen briefings in the Senate and more in the House. Coons answered that he had not participated in or benefited from those briefings, even though he was openly weighing whether to support an 18-month clean extension. That exchange matters because a briefing process can look transparent on paper while still controlling who actually receives the information needed to challenge the agency. This is the real pattern forming under the surface. On travel costs, Patel gave a mission story instead of a number. On Iran expertise, he gave a denial and a new center instead of a detailed accounting of who was removed and what was lost. On Section 702, he pointed to many briefings while one senator directly involved in oversight said he had not gotten what he needed. Each answer has the same shape. Sound confident, cite activity, avoid the narrow point that creates accountability. That may work in cable news combat, but it should not work in front of the United States Senate. The moral scene here is not about Senator Chris Coons winning a moment against Kash Patel. It is about the people who never sit in that hearing room. Americans whose safety depends on whether Iran-related threats are tracked early, judges who need protection, local police who need intelligence, and citizens whose private communications may be touched by surveillance powers they will never see. When the FBI asks for trust, money, secrecy, aircraft, surveillance authority, and the benefit of the doubt, the price is supposed to be honesty under questioning. Not perfect answers, not theatrical certainty, but honesty. Because when the agency with the badge refuses to show the bill, explain the firings, and brief the skeptics, it teaches the public one poisonous lesson. Oversight is real only when power allows it to be real. And this is where the hearing stops being about one trip to Milan and becomes a lesson about how institutions rot in plain sight. Not because every official trip is corrupt, not because every intelligence operation is fake, and not because the FBI should stop protecting Americans overseas. The lesson is simpler and more brutal. When a powerful official is asked for a number, the number should not have to be chased through smoke. Kash Patel had every chance to say, here is what it cost, here is why it was necessary, here is how the public benefit outweighed the expense. Instead, he gave Senator Chris Coons a mission narrative, and the missing cost became the loudest answer in the room. My personal view is this: the most dangerous double standard in government is not hypocrisy by itself, because Washington is already full of that cheap perfume. The real danger is hypocrisy protected by secrecy, wrapped in national security language, and delivered with enough confidence that people stop asking for receipts. Kash Patel once treated government jet travel as a symbol of waste when Chris Wray was the target, but when the question moved to his own travel, the standards suddenly became flexible. That is not strength. That is the oldest trick in power. Make the rule sharp for your enemy, then make it soft for yourself. And ordinary Americans understand this better than most politicians think. A family paying higher grocery bills cannot answer the cashier with a speech about patriotism. A small business owner cannot tell the bank, "Trust me, the mission was important," while refusing to show the books. A taxpayer cannot dodge the IRS by listing good deeds and heroic intentions. So why should the FBI director get softer standards than the citizens funding the seat he sits in? That is the moral bottom line. This was not only about Kash Patel, Senator Chris Coons, Milan, Italy, Section 702, or one unanswered travel bill. It was about whether oversight means anything when the official being questioned can answer around the question and still walk away untouched. A republic does not collapse only when laws are broken. It weakens when powerful people learn that explanations can replace accountability. So ask yourself this: if the people holding the badge do not have to show the receipt, how long before the public stops believing the badge at all? If this breakdown gave you value, hit like, share it, and subscribe for more political hearing analysis. Drop your comment below and tell me whether Kash Patel answered the question or dodged it, because accountability does not survive in silence.